Tracy Cook with the Montana State Library. I'm the lead consulting librarian, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating today's session. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with Jennie and Crosby. Many of you have been able to attend the previous webinars we've done in this series. They're part of the local government series we've been trying out to see if we can help you talk about libraries and their value and how they benefit community members in a way that local government officials are able to hear what you have to say. I am joined today by Jennie and Crosby, who I will introduce in a few moments. The format of today's session is going to be more of a conversation. I think you will very much enjoy listening to Jennie and Crosby. I know I have, and just in our preparation for this webinar, I've really learned a lot and certainly loved the way that Crosby in particular talks about literacy and its importance to community members. So it is my pleasure to introduce Jennie Stapp, the Montana State Librarian. Many of you know her. Like you, she is a library director, and she works regularly with officials who set budgets and who have a lot of influence over the policies and the way that the state library works. So she has a lot of practice with talking to leaders and using language that resonates with them. She is joined by Crosby Kemper III, who was the former director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the Kansas City Public Library. His background prior to that was in business, so he has a lot of different experiences that he's bringing to this conversation. I will just say, when I've listened to Crosby speak, I've been very impressed with his ability to be very down to earth and funny, and yet really talk about the importance of libraries to their communities. He has a passion for literacy, and so that's why we're going to be talking to him today about libraries and literacy. If you have any questions or would like to share an observation, Colette and I are monitoring chat, so feel free to just post something in the chat, and one of us will interrupt Jennie or Crosby to ask your question. So with that, Jennie and Crosby, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Tracy, thank you so much. Thank you first for hosting this really important webinar series about connecting with local governments. It's a really important part of our job, and maybe something that those of us who are library directors didn't really anticipate when we got into this profession. When we talk to people about libraries, we often hear why people love libraries. But local government officials have to make very hard decisions about how they are wisely spending our taxpayer dollars. And it's incumbent upon us to make sure that they understand and can appreciate how libraries are contributing to the fabric of the communities that they are working to support. And I know that that's a perspective that Crosby really appreciates and shares. I had the privilege of meeting Crosby in probably about 2013 or 2014, when Crosby and I both served on the board of the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, which is a coalition of people within community acre institutions that are advocating for broadband policy and broadband funding at the federal level. And we have certainly benefited from their work here in Montana. And then I had the opportunity to be a part of the process of recommending Crosby to be the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And then when he moved into that role, he tapped me to serve on their board. And so I've been able to work with Crosby now over several years. When Crosby became the director of IMLS, literally within a matter of weeks, we went into lockdown mode with the COVID-19 pandemic. And Crosby was behind a lot of the research that you might remember, the REALM project, the Reopening Archives, Museums, and Libraries program that brought together researchers, medical professionals, and professionals from within archives, museums, and libraries to understand and make data-informed decisions about how we could safely reopen our libraries, archives, and museums. And so that really took up a great deal of focus of Crosby's time in his early years as the IMLS director. And when things were kind of finally getting back to normal, one of the very first meetings that Crosby convened was about literacy specifically, and bringing together about 100 thought leaders from across the profession to come together and talk about the importance of literacy and the role of libraries in supporting literacy. This is a great passion of Crosby's, and that work continued with work from IMLS in their Empowering Readers and Empowering Citizens work that's continued. So Crosby, thank you so much for being willing to join us in this conversation about the importance of literacy, the role of libraries in supporting literacy, and how we can talk about that work with our public officials and other community influencers. And I wanted to start our conversation by asking you, in your mind, what is the definition of literacy? Because I think in libraries, that's a definition that doesn't necessarily have hard boundaries.
Right. So first, before addressing the question, I want to say thank you for inviting me to do this. And as Jenny has explained, we have a long relationship going back a long way, built originally around broadband for libraries and our patrons, et cetera, but in a lot of things, in a lot of ways. What I've learned over the years is that Jenny knows more about everything than I know about anything. So you should just factor that into our conversation. The literacy, the definition of literacy is there are a number of different kinds of literacy. We talk about literacy. We talk about numeracy. We talk about civic literacy. And we talk about levels of literacy. There's a form of literacy that a lot of librarians, most librarians, will encounter regularly in the library, which is people who know enough, who identify words, sort of pictographic literacy, if you will, can identify stop signs and basic sentences about basic things in their lives, can read labels in the grocery store. But that's still very limited literacy. And in our increasingly complex world, our information heavy world, with things on offer from jobs to culture to the aspects of your daily life that impinge upon your basic knowledge of language, that make literacy even more important than it's ever been. And so I would define literacy from a library point of view as the ability to navigate your world. And we use that term a lot in the library world over the last 15 or 20 years, that navigators is what we as librarians are in helping people, but we need to give them the tools to navigate for themselves. And literacy, that kind of literacy, is, I think, deeply important, and is happening at all age levels too. There are things like that the IMLS got fairly involved in. The Kansas City Public Library was deeply involved in when I was the director of Career Online High School, which is essentially education for folks who've dropped out. But literacy is a key component of that. You have to meet a level of literacy to participate in the program. And so the successful programs are also ways of giving the opportunity for literacy to folks who want to be involved in this program that lifts them to the next level of the high school equivalency graduation. And so the answer to your question is pretty broad, which is to say there are a lot of different levels and a lot of different ways of saying it. But I think in library terms, it's giving the tools to navigate the world.
I love that. And that really, really resonates with me. Maybe you can, building on that definition, speak to the connections between literacy and then social and community engagement.
Well, and I think that's a big part of it. And in libraries, as sort of the catch-all community institution today, there is, I think we're most of us are aware of these numbers, and we'll be aware of these numbers in our community. But there's no place that more people come to, no public space, other than sports, than the library. It is the civic space in America. And was one of the interesting things in the Realm Project is we had to explain that to people from the CDC and Johns Hopkins, the health program at Johns Hopkins, which is probably the best in the world. And they didn't understand the importance, the intensity of usage of library by everybody, essentially. And so we have a civic role that is clearer all the time to people at the local level, particularly the local government level. In my speeches as director of the IMLS, I used to refer to going to 3 meetings right before and during the pandemic. One was Rivka Sass. Some of you might know Rivka, who is an Omaha and Sacramento librarian. She got the Community Librarian of the Year award at the last meeting before the pandemic put us in the dark in Nashville. I went to this meeting, and the deputy mayor of Sacramento came to the meeting and said, "Rivka, whenever we have a problem in Sacramento, we turn to the library and to Rivka." Then I went to a meeting in Memphis during the pandemic, and the deputy mayor showed up, and Memphis library stayed open through almost the entire pandemic. They were closed for like 3 weeks, and that was it. And he said, we turn to Keenan McCloy and the Memphis library whenever we have a problem in Memphis. Then I went to the Highwood Library, tiny little library outside of Chicago. It's a story that I use all the time. They vaccinated the entire community of 5,000 early on in the pandemic, universal vaccination. And the congressman showed up, the mayor showed up, the state senator showed up, and they all said, we turn to the Highwood Public Library whenever there's a problem in this community. We all know that. Everybody in this meeting knows that we are problem solvers. Librarians are problem solvers today for all kinds of problems that libraries typically didn't have to deal with. The reason that literacy is important to me is that it's the underlying solution. If there's a structural problem, we hear a lot today about structural racism, we hear about structural poverty, et cetera, all of which have truth attached to them. But the underlying structural problem we have, the thing that if you look at any group that is not achieving, whether it's people of color, poor people in the Appalachians, the Ozarks near me, you will find that literacy is related to it. You will find that crime problems, which are related also to achievement, are directly related to literacy. You'll find that health problems are directly related to literacy. All the things that affect the community are directly related to literacy. And therefore, the library's role in that is something that we need to be talking about and dealing with. Historically, libraries have always been about literacy to some extent. We've always been about reading. Reading is about literacy. And we've always been about serving folks on the other side of our various divides. The library is a place where services are free. You don't have to have money to participate in whatever the library is doing. And that's an important fact. And it's an important fact about literacy. Our illiterate populations are also our poorest population. And the second fact that's really important about literacy in libraries, and that's different about literacy and schools, is that the library is the place where the child or the parent or the adult, who has limited literacy, can choose what they what they want to read, can become enthusiastic, indeed even joyful about what they read. Marianne Wolf, who was one of the keynotes for our literacy conference in DC a few years ago that Jenny mentioned, is particularly good in her book, Reader Come Back. She talks about the child picking a book for the first time and what a liberating experience that is. And that happens in the library. Sometimes it will happen in school, but that's the core mission of the library, is to reach out to the child, to reach out to the family, and provide the opportunity for the child to engage with a whole new world through their own ability to pick out a book.
Mm-hmm. And we talk a lot about libraries helping to build that family bond around reading and around literacy. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with intergenerational literacy and the benefits you've seen with reading in families?
Sure. So there are a lot of things that I could talk about in that regard, but let me start with the one of the most important basic pieces of research about literacy that's been expanded and qualified heavily over the last 30 plus years. Hart and Risley, two researchers at the university, professors at the University of Kansas, came up with what we now know as the 30 million word gap between what kids, typically poor children, who will typically be in stressed family circumstances, the number of words that they are likely to hear in the first 6 years of their lives. And that makes some sense. Typically, there aren't enough adults around. The adults are engaged in work. There's not a rich neighborhood environment, et cetera. But one of the things that we've learned over time, and this gets to the intergenerational question, is that it's the quality of words, the quality of the interaction which those words are heard and spoken, that's very important. And and one example of that is that we know that the best environment for learning to read is an environment in which adult, typically mom and dad in particular, but it can be the librarian, it can be the manager at McDonald's, it can be any adult, not only reading to the child, but getting the child to read to the adult. And again, as I say, it's not necessarily the parents. The parents are the usual providers of that, but it's something that happens in libraries increasingly. Story times, historically, story times are are particularly a librarian reading to the kids. More and more, we've done outreach versions of that. So it's not just the kids showing up for story time in the library. It's the librarian showing up at the daycare center, at the kindergarten, wherever it is, to read to the child. But also increasingly, we know that those kinds of story times where they are interactive, where some part of it involves the child reading back to the librarian, to the teacher, to mom and dad, is liberating for the child, is enabling for the child, is supportive of the child's own sense of power in reading. And so increasingly that's important in libraries, that we understand that, and it's increasingly important that it's not just handing a book to a child, it's not just reading to a child is still very important, but engaging with the child, making sure the child is a factor and sees herself as a factor in what's going on, as someone who has more than a role, a passive role of receiving something.
Yeah, that's so true. And we see the impact of librarians helping parents as those first teachers of children, really empowering those parents and caregivers to have the skills, have the confidence to engage their children in those kinds of behaviors. Because as you said, a lot of people from a variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds didn't come out of literate or reading families and probably weren't exposed to those kinds of experiences when they themselves were growing up. And
Right.
it's those aren't innate skills that someone has. So
And the
that's
other
a
thing
really
that
important role.
libraries can do, as you just mentioned, lots of parents have limited literacy, and so reading to the child is difficult. So one of the things we did early on in Kansas City in my tenure was to establish a relationship with the adult literacy program. Now, if you're in a small town, you may not have a special program for adult literacy, but recognizing that adult literacy is part of the library's mission too is important, and being as friendly and warm as you can with an adult who's got limited literacy, and particularly relating their literacy issues to their children's issues, and say and telling the adult, we can help you too, and it will help your child. And I think we found that there lots of adults are receptive to that if it's put in terms of helping their child learn to read to help their literacy. But of course, they're also going to know. I know, one of the most moving speeches I ever heard with Literacy KC, the adult literacy program in Kansas City, as there was a woman who spoke to an early version of our partnership, a big fundraising dinner that we did, who said she was working with Literacy KC and with the library because she needed to improve her literacy in order to get a TSA job. And then she came back a year later and spoke and said she had achieved the level of literacy she needed to. She got her TSA job, and she said it was really exciting. She was very happy to have this job, but saying also she was now able to read to her children.
Wow.
And I think there wasn't a dry eye in when she got to that. So I think that the intergenerational part of this is really important. Intergenerational poverty is something we know that there's an underclass in America that can't dig out, and it's those folks who have intergenerational poverty, and the ladder out of intergenerational poverty is raising the literacy of all the generations that are in a household or related to each other, interacting with each other. And so being aware of that is, I think, a librarian's responsibility today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You started to speak to this a little bit, but could you share your thoughts on how literacy and having a literate community benefits the community?
Sure. And one of the things that I learned as a librarian was the direct relationship of literacy to things like crime. So we were the Kansas City Library and the St. Louis Library were close to the two long-term criminal release centers in the state of Missouri. So all the folks who've been in a long-term who were coming out after their 20 years or 15 or 30 years in prison were released in these two sites, one of which was almost right next door to the St. Louis Public Library, and one of which was on the pathway from in Kansas City from the prison. And it was a huge part of our homeless problem, was a huge part of our crime problem, a huge part of health problems in the city were these folks. But we did find that as we generated programs with Literacy KC, the adult literacy program, directly at these folks, they would show up at the library and participate in the program, improving their behavior in the library for those who were in the library, and improving their chances in the other the other two and outcomes in the other two places that they tended to go during the day, which was the day labor folks, or in Kansas City there was a longer term employment office for these folks, sponsored by the corporate community, and the Western Missouri Mental Health, dealing with their mental health, their addiction problems, literacy or illiteracy and addiction. There's a huge relationship between that, and there's a huge relationship to that, to health outcomes and to crime. And so understanding that, and understanding the one place where you can get to people early in their lives, and at the same time you can get to them later in their lives if they're still having the literacy problem as a problem relating to those issues, is the library. And so I think that, and I think that's also a selling point in the community to the value of the library that most people don't know. Again, I know this isn't universally true, but it's by and large true that the homeless programs in any city or town that has a homeless problem in this country are almost always inclusive of, or in the case of Kansas City, we were central to the engagement with homelessness for the community. The Homeless Coalition met in the library. We did regular programs with the homeless shelters, bringing folks from the shelter to the library in an organized way, and vice versa. Story times to the shelters, particularly shelters where there were kids, where there were families. So selling the library and literacy, what we do on the literacy side to the community as one major aspect, of dealing with all the problems that a modern American community has, is both true and important.
I think one of the challenges that we all face is that focusing on literacy as a way to benefit the community and help a community address some of these challenges that communities face, it's a long-term strategy. It's a strategy that's not going to yield immediate benefits, and communities are facing real immediate challenges like overcrowding in our community jails, for example, the homeless crisis that you spoke to. How would you go about communicating the importance of investment in literacy to this long-term strategy in the face of those kinds of more immediate needs?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways. I mean, one, there is a lot of research out there, and you can use the research to explain the relationship of literacy to all of our problems. But and one part of that research, and Jenny's heard me talk about this. Anybody who's been anywhere near me hears me talk about this research. The research of Raj Chetty at Harvard. It has something called Opportunity Insights that a group of people, MIT, Harvard, and elsewhere around the country, including a researcher from the University of Montana, whose name I'm blanking on right now. I'm sorry, I forgot to look it up, who's now working for the IMLS.
Greg Gilpin.
Yeah, Greg Gilpin. Greg has done some of this research, and he's now working with the IMLS. And the research shows that the folks who have social mobility, who can move from the lowest quintile to the top quintile or some quintile in between, who beat poverty, those folks are folks who have some kind of social engagement with the folks in the top two quintiles as they're growing up. And it relates to some other research that they've done that's called the neighborhood effect, where they looked at some larger cities. The one that's used frequently to demonstrate this is LA, where they saw that Compton and Watts and other places around the country that have almost identical demographics, particularly poverty, and the other key demographics, race, education levels, things like that, can have very different outcomes. And they use Compton and Watts, and Compton has a much better outcomes in terms of educational success and ultimately economic success than Watts does. And the demographics are very similar. Now, there's some things that are clearly different. Crime levels are different, much higher in Watts than in Compton, as an example. But they will also tell you they think there are cultural aspects to this. And having talked to them, and the IMLS is working with them now, my belief that libraries play a role in this, that anchor institutions, as Shelby, Jennie and I were involved in, like to call them, have a big impact on this, and it's partly because we're a place where we bring people together. We bring people together from all social backgrounds, from all economic backgrounds, and activities happen together, and it's that rubbing together effect in certain communities that can improve the social mobility, improve the life chances of kids who are at the bottom, who are growing up in under-resourced or unresourced environments. So I think it's important to tell that to the community, to the civic leaders, city leaders. It's also important to show that by working in partnership with as many community institutions as you can. And I know in Kansas City, this was true. We had some neighborhoods that were really well organized and the neighborhood organizations worked well, and other neighborhoods where that wasn't true. And we could tell we had more success where the neighborhood organization was strong. So encouraging neighborhoods, encouraging church engagement. Typically in the African-American community in Kansas City, the strongest individual institutions were the churches. The strongest networks were through the churches. So if there was a neighborhood organization that was failing or non-existent, getting the church involved was very important. And I don't want to indicate to you that we solved all social problems in Kansas City. I'm talking about places where we thought we were making them a little better here and a little better there, and helping people out. So I think it's very important to do that, and then to show the civic leadership, the city leadership, the business leadership, how that works and what you're doing and how you're bringing people together. One thing that everybody knows, and the vast majority of Americans hate about our country, is the polarization that we have. And libraries, schools are not an answer to that for a variety of reasons we could go into. Libraries are an answer to that. Libraries are doing lots of things around the country in very different ways, different communities, different ways, to bring people together. And that has not only the socioeconomic benefits that Chetty's research shows, it has the benefit that we're all looking for of lowering the temperature, lowering the polarization in the community, which is something we all want and need.
Desperately. I loved your image of communities rubbing together. That really resonated with me. I was remembering back about 10 years ago when the Billings Public Library, which is Montana's largest public library, had their grand opening for their new downtown library. And I had the opportunity to attend, and there were people from every single walk of life at that event, people who were quite literally homeless to women in very lovely cocktail dresses and evening gowns. They're celebrating the exact same organization and the institution in their community. And that still stays with me today, even 10 years later. That is what struck me the most about that event and that opportunity for that community.
Yeah.
So I think I hear you saying you believe that libraries are making a difference. Libraries are making a difference in the area of literacy. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. So the vision I have for this is the interaction with the largest number of kids in particular, but families that have that have literacy issues, families that have socioeconomic issues, in which there huge overlap there. And so I think about the kids as an example. The largest daycare center is called Operation Breakthrough in the state of Missouri. Is in Kansas City. It's a few blocks from one of the branch libraries in Kansas City. There two nuns started this as a Catholic oriented thing, but the kids are mostly African American, come almost universally, and it's extraordinary what the problems these kids have. They have almost 100% broken families. They have a significant amount of abuse of one kind and another, physical, sexual abuse. I mean, very high percentage of that. And these kids who are 5 years old, 6 years old. And when I arrived at the library, we were already doing some story time stuff, but we built that up into a regular story time, regular engagement through books, book giveaways. Ultimately, the Dolly Parton program. Dolly Parton program now is universal in the state of Missouri. Every child in the state of Missouri can sign up for Dolly Parton. The Dolly Parton program, get books. And we helped the nuns organize the Kansas City Chiefs. You may have heard of a literacy expert named Patrick Mahomes, doing readings with the kids, which of course they're all wide awake when Patrick Travis shows up. Taylor has not showed up yet.
All right.
Expecting that to happen any day. And the results of that, most of these kids end up going to a charter school called Gordon Parks. And Gordon Parks, you might know, is a great African-American photographer, director. He directed Shaft, the first big African-American movie hit in my era. Anyway, and the scores are not spectacular at Gordon Parks for these kids, but their proficiency in reading is higher than the public schools in the same neighborhoods, and where the kids actually have slightly better demographic background and slightly better background from the family and the abuse, et cetera, point of view. And so we know that Operation Breakthrough is making a difference. We know that Gordon Parks is making a difference, and we don't know for sure, but we think because the proficiency numbers are better there in reading, we're pretty sure that the library has a role in that. Now, Travis Kelce has a role in that too. The organized version of this was 400 kids. That's a pretty large number of kids for our community.
Yeah.
Is very important. And not every child in that group is gonna be a success in life, but they've got a much better chance than if we weren't there.
Absolutely. We had the chance to travel the state a few weeks ago, and one of the visiting libraries in our library federations, and we were talking about support for teens in our libraries, and a number of the librarians commented on wanting to kind of reinvigorate that love and joy of reading in that particular population. Sadly, Montana doesn't have any professional sport teams. We don't have a Patrick Mahomes, but some people were talking about just having their local high school football players read as a way to model and encourage reading amongst that kind of middle school age population, and in order to continue to encourage that love of reading into the teen and early adult years. I think that's great. It's great. Can you speak to just maybe one or two more examples of some of the things that have really sparked joy for you in your career, either at Kansas City or at IMLS, around the development of literacy?
Um, sure. So, it, I think it's really important to have people in the library, programs in the library that kids of all kinds can identify with. So, as an example, and I think there are ways of doing this. We were fortunate in our access to some of this, but some of it was just we were very entrepreneurial about it. And I think my view of the world is that children's librarians, there are so many great children's librarians, and they love what they're doing, they love the kids, and they become very entrepreneurial.
Mm.
So one of the things that we did that was a lot of fun is we brought interesting people uh, who looked like the kids in our. We were a majority minority library district.
Mhm.
We were about 45% African American, and by the time I left the library, we were probably close to 20% Hispanic. And we were able to bring the nation's first African American astronaut, Guy Bluford, because he was a cousin of Lucille Bluford, who edited for a long time, for like 50 years, the African American newspaper, the Kansas City Call, and our most inner city branch was named after her. And so we reorganized the library, renovated the library, and we invited him to come and speak. And we had a whole lot of families bring their kids to an evening speech that he gave in the Central Library. And there were all these 5 and 6 and 7 and 8-year-old kids who, we had a question and answer session for them afterwards. And they would raise their hand, and they all asked a version of the same question. It was the same question over and over again. How do I become an astronaut? And his answer to every single one of those questions was a version of learn to read, learn math, learn science. And I know that there were kids who were, choosing books on their way out of the library that night that would help them along to becoming an astronaut. And I think relating library programming to the aspirations that all children have ultimately, whatever it is. Harry Potter, when I first arrived at the library, Harry Potter was a very big deal. And we had lines around the block for our sort of midnight. We didn't actually do it at midnight, but our late night on publication day of Harry Potter, and getting the Harry Potter and books into the hands of kids on a discounted basis. We were able to give away. We raised money for. We were able to give away 400 copies, first 400 kids, and that included. It was extraordinary to see. It included a lot of kids from the poorer parts of our community, African American kids from the poorest part of the African American community, showed up for these events, and were wearing their witch hats, carrying their wands, etc. There are so many ways that, as a community, we can appeal to children. And can do it in an aspirational way, and the most exciting events that we ever did in the library were those events where parents were bringing their kids, where the community was coming together around something that had to do with literature, or with science, or with some activity that the kids were really interested in, and tied it to a book, tied it to reading. And we were doing those all the time, and partnering with other folks. The Boston Children's Museum has created and the IMLS funded this. I didn't know that until I got to the IMLS. But we established a relationship with Union Station, our train station in Kansas City, which created one of these Boston Children's Museums, basically a branch of the Boston Children's Museum, which is happening around the country, and they're doing very exciting interactive things with the kids that have worked in Boston, and where they partnered with the Boston Public Library, and there are things like that that are going on all over the country. You know, partnering with the universities in Montana that have great science programs, or you know, interesting programs around mining or whatever it might be. Kids are really interested in how things work.
Yeah.
So if you build something around how something works and how you too can become an engineer, you too can become a computer scientist, you too can become an astronaut. You know, that's huge. And that's available to everybody. I think that's available for everybody to do. There's somebody in your community who's gone on to do an interesting job somewhere, maybe still in your community, or they'll come back to your community and talk to the kids about that interesting job.
Yeah, sparking joy and inspiration, and helping to create that aspirational vision for young children.
Right.
That's great. That's great. So I'm trying to kind of recap some of my key takeaways, and if I missed anything, let me know, and then maybe we'll open it up to a few more questions. Obviously, being a place for children to access books, supporting that kind of intergenerational reading and modeling, that literacy support. Being that place where different communities, different socioeconomic communities can rub together in the library, and not being afraid to embrace that role that libraries have. Build relationships with other like-minded community support organizations to support one another's missions and extend the reach and missions of both the library and those organizations. And then demonstrate that support and the impact of that support to our community leaders, our local government officials, and other civic leaders. And then I think one of my takeaways for us here at the State Library, Crosby is probably the most well-read, well-researched person I know. I appreciate that Colette has been putting in the chat a number of links to the researchers that Crosby has referenced. I think we need to put together a book list or a reading list from this webinar that we can then make available to local government officials in Montana who have an interest in and may be open to reflecting on the kinds of research that Crosby has shared with us today. I think that's a direct action that we can take.
Jenny, if I could talk about one thing that I meant to talk about that I think is very important, and again, every librarian will probably know this. That's summer reading programs. And there isn't very good research. There's some research, and it's all positive, about the benefits of library summer reading programs. The Rand Corp has done some academics working with Rand Corp, some folks from the University of Pittsburgh I know were involved in this, that we've talked to at the IMLS, showing that a high quality summer reading program in a school district that a school district runs will have a very big effect on the summer slide. We all know about the summer slide, and it has a huge effect on our lower quintile, socioeconomically under-resourced folks, the underclass folks that need our help the most. Those programs close that gap, which is one of the biggest problems in learning to read and in reading proficiency. I believe, and I've talked to Chetty, the Opportunity Insights, Nathaniel Hendren, actually, who's a co-executive of the Opportunity Insights group, about doing, and I think Matt at the IMLS is following up with them now on this, is doing a study of high quality summer reading programs in libraries, a random control trial level of study.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there aren't many libraries doing programs that are at the level that get defined as high quality, where you're insisting on proof of completion of reading, and then relating it to scores later, maintenance of reading scores in the school. There are some. The one of scale that I know of is Pat Lisinski in the Columbus Library, and their numbers are good. They show an impact, and they've maintained a relatively high quality. But that's something that we ought to be trying to do more of, and in doing it in partnership with school districts. And it takes some effort, and it takes some money, and it takes volunteers who will make sure that there's a fair amount of completion in reading. But I think we know that can be a highly leveraged part of what we do. So I didn't want to finish this without talking about that. Summer reading is really important.
Great. Thanks, Crosby. I wanted to just ask if anybody else had any questions or reflections on what Crosby has shared with us today. And while people might be gathering their thoughts or preparing to put something in the chat, Crosby, I wanted to let you know that in Montana, I think it's 53 of the 56 counties now have affiliates for the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. Bobby should correct me if I've got that number wrong. And about 2/3 of those programs, the affiliates in those counties, are their local library or their local library friends groups. So that's something that's been important to our the First Lady here in Montana, and we're happy to be able to support that effort as well.
And I will share that Colette and I have been working with the next presenter for this series, and he is very interested in the impact libraries and their summer reading programs have on school success.
Great.
So I think that should be a really interesting series that we're scheduling.
Yeah. One other thing that I'll say that is part of my standard speech about this that I think is important is there's been a lot of talk about the science of reading lately. And
yes.
and there's an interesting book about it's basically a history of the science of reading by a guy named Adrian Johns. It's called The Science of Reading. And we've really known this since the 50s that you need to be teaching phonics is part of it. That's usually phonics versus whole language is kind of the war that went on. But really what it is teaching kids coding, which essentially is syllabic awareness, as opposed to the sort of picture way of learning to read. One of the things that we now do know from random control trial kinds of research, and we've really known this for about 25 years, but there's a lot of research now, is that kids who are taught a sort of whole language pictographic can do reasonably well up to third grade. They lose the advantages they have from that at about third grade, and after that, it becomes a hugely limiting factor for the growth of proficiency of reading. And I think most librarians actually do know that a certain amount of coding is really important to teach kids to sound out syllables. Is really the simplest way of putting it, and that anything that can be helpful to a child at the very beginning of their reading career in that regard, and making sure that parents understand that, making sure the adults in their lives understand that is, I think, important.
Interesting. I'll share one quick literacy related story, not from Montana, but from South Dakota, and it came out of their talking book program. The story was from a woman whose husband was going blind, And so he enrolled in South Dakota's Talking Book program to have access to those reading materials. And it opened up an entire new world of joy for him. And he and his wife began talking about books and reading and literature in a way that they had never experienced in their marriage before. And he finally admitted to her that he had been functionally illiterate his entire life. And it was with the loss of his sight and access to that program that he was able to develop that love of reading, love of books, and a connection with his family that he had never experienced before.
It's interesting you say that because I haven't looked at the numbers lately. But one of the things that's been true of the last, roughly speaking, 15 years in the library world is that the checking out of physical books had plateaued about 2010. And has been a decline. And that has a lot to do with the 2009-2010 introduction of the iPhone. The smartphone has replaced a lot of what we've done physically in the library and physical books, et cetera, et cetera. We all know that. The one part of our universe that has grown during that period of time dramatically, and at least as of last year was still growing, is audiobooks. And I think and part of that is about literacy. And it's a different form of literacy, but it is a form of literacy. And it's also about the way we live. A lot of people spend a lot of time in cars. That's part of it. So I think it is important. I think you're demonstrating. I would say this comes in so many different shapes and forms, and as librarians, we need to be open to how we engage with people, and it's not going to be the same for everybody. And we need to keep doing the things we're doing that will keep us engaged with our community.
Yeah, I mean, you said it so well. If literacy is the ability to navigate our world, certainly audiobooks and other resources like that are a part of the puzzle that helps us navigate our worlds.
Right.
Crosby, thank you. This has been an absolute delight.
Yes,
Well,
thank you.
Great to be with all of you.
Yes. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, and I really loved that you emphasized the partnerships, and I love that you emphasized the aspirational. I think a lot of people in our communities feel just understandably anxious and stressed and overwhelmed about our world, and yet you took this concept of literacy and are like, it's the solution, and that's very powerful to think of it in that way. So thank you.
It benefits the community in every way.
Yeah. Yes, it does. And thank you to all of you who listened in today. If you were like me, you were probably taking notes and jotting down things. And we will capture the resources that Crosby recommended and share them with you so that if you would like, you can certainly take a look at those and see what works for you as well. And thank you again, Jennie and Crosby, for this conversation. It was really helpful and very inspiring and very moving. And that's another good reminder of how powerful being able to read and process information is in people's lives.
Librarians save the world.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.